Hello, everyone. We'll give you people a few more minutes for people to trickle in and start in a minute or two.
Okie dokie. Hello, everyone.
Uh, all right, so I'll just do a little intro blather. I don't need to say that much because this is probably not anyone's first talk of the day. My name's David Montgomery. I'm the host of the Siècle podcast about 19th century France, but I'm not the star of the show here today. That is Rick. Uh, Rick Lepetovan is the one of the two hosts of the Curiosity of podcast, which is a involves a father and son, son not being here today, discussing things they are curious about from science and history and monsters and games and everything else, the quirky and the unusual from all around the world and right at home. Uh, Rick likes literally any dumplings, according to his survey, which to me sounds like a challenge. But uh,
I go,
Rick,
yeah.
I'll hand things over to you and be around to monitor the Q&A at the end. Feel free to, if you're in the audience, feel free to drop any questions or comments or reactions as the talk goes, or save them for the end. Rick, take it away.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you, David. Yeah, I'm Rick, and normally I am with Anton, my son, but not today. It's just me. So this is a bit new for me. So hopefully it all goes well. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so when we got the topic of deception, I was thinking that history, obviously, it's full of deception, and sometimes those deceptions they are really minor, small ones, and other times they are big enough to change the fate of empires. And then I started to think about it more, and that I was actually probably less interested in the lies and more interested in what actually is the truth, because that's the other side of deception. And is there actually a singular, consistent truth to human history? And maybe at the subatomic level, you could say there is. But at the human scale, there are probably as many truths as there are people, and the tales that those people tell. So I don't believe there's any such thing as an absolute fundamental truth. There are as many as there are, rather, what we see as the truth is usually like the consensus of the masses. And there are many masses and many different consensuses, and they can be in opposition to one another and they can change over time. Um, we could also probably say the same thing about what it means, what justice means, what it means to be a good person. Because my idea of justice might not be the same as your idea of justice. And there's no fundamental force in the universe called justice. There's nothing woven into the fabric of the universe of what it is to be a good person. Because these are human inventions, either to help society run or maybe to control people, or just to help us get along and get by. So that also begs the question, is it sometimes okay to kill? Are there circumstances where murder can be taken as, I know, maybe the truest form of justice or freedom? And can you deceive somebody? And when is deception okay for a greater truth? Okay, get my slides working. So it's mid-March, 1655, and Antonio Contrani, he's thrashing about in his bed. He has agonizing stomach cramps and he's got a fever, he's vomiting, and it's stealing his rest and sapping all of his strength. And within days, he'll be dead. And his young wife, Elena, she mourns his sudden passing because he was aged just 30 years old. And, oops, I don't want to do that, sorry. And his young wife, yeah, she mourns his parting. So Antonio, he had worked for his father-in-law in the family millinery business. And customers who had visited the shop, they commented on the closeness between him and Elena. And there's a quote here saying, they made much of each other, joked together, and if he told her to do something, Elena immediately hurried to get it done. However, before the sun set on September of that year, tragedy would strike the family again. And two more men from the family, Elena's uncle and her sister Angela's husband, would also die. And they'd all die from the same strange, mysterious, and painful illness. And news of these sudden rapid deaths, they shocked the neighbours in the area. And Other commenters said of Angela's husband, Giuseppe, he was so young, strong, and determined. And the couple had been observed many times together at the window, laughing and joking and playing guitar. So it seemed like close, happy couples. But soon, the shock of their death started to turn to suspicion because it seems not everything was right. Because the neighbours felt that the young widow seemed to get over their mourning rather too fast, and they were soon spotted in the wandering the streets of Rome. And on one occasion, they were seen arguing with a old woman, and other times they were seen commuting with a suspected witch called Giovanna de Grandis, and also a red-haired beggar named Brazio da Farina. And this caused suspicions to start to grow, and rumours started to spread and form. I mean, had these two young women, had they killed their husbands? And one of their neighbours was a particularly nosy oil seller, and she knew the women quite well. So she's quite bold, and she approached them, and she asked them, "I've heard lots of rumours of people from all around Rome saying you murdered your husbands with some kind of poisonous potion you gave them to drink." And at this, the two sisters laughed. I mean, what a ridiculous idea. I mean, who would believe such stupid lies? But it turns out these weren't the only suspicious deaths happening on the streets of Rome at that time. Now, before we continue with our narrative, let's look a little bit at the background to marriage in Rome in the 1600s. So today, I think most people probably marry for love, but that's not always been the case. Because in early modern Rome, things were not so romantic. His daughters were often married off at age 14 or 15 to men much older than them. Like, could be several times their age. And marriages, they weren't arranged for love, but probably more for business reasons or social reasons or political reasons, or often just simply for survival. So Elena, when she was married, she was only 16 years old and her husband was 25. But oftentimes there'd be an even bigger age gap than this. But interestingly, her older sister, Angela Armelina, she was 19 and her husband was 22, and is also from a lower social status. So perhaps in her case, it was actually a marriage of love. And lower class weddings were generally more flexible than the upper class ones. But some of the key factors were financial security, and parental consent was always an important part as well. So what are the fate of these young girls who got married so young? In the 17th century, Italy, women had very limited control over their lives and very, very few freedoms. For instance, they didn't control their own income, and they could not enter into contracts, and they couldn't even choose their own place of burial. So they had very, very few rights. So if you've had all your freedoms taken away from you, and if having all your freedoms taken away from you isn't enough, these women are also often abused by their husbands. There's one guide to marriage from the period called Rules for Married Life advised: "You must beat your wife if she delights in standing at the window and willingly lends a ready ear to any dishonest man." So they had no freedom to their life. So what do you do if you want to escape this? Well, the Catholic Church didn't really recognise divorce, and other forms of annulment were either slow or expensive, and inevitably it would be the woman who was left with the tarnished reputation. So women were seen as second-class citizens. As Mary Astor wrote in her 1700s Reflections upon Marriage, "If all men are born free, why are all women born slaves?" So when you're forced into an unhappy marriage and treated poorly, your partner's hitting you, but it's seen as acceptable by society, and divorce isn't an option on the table, I mean, what can you do? And sadly, sometimes your only escape from this desperate situation is murder. Now, some of the names I've given so far you might not be familiar with. However, I think a lot of people will have heard of Julia Tofana. Now, usually when people mention her name, that's the head or the mastermind of a sophisticated network of women in Rome who helped mistreated wives poison their husbands. But the reality is probably a little bit different to that. Because time and the intention of those recounting the story has altered or embellished the narrative. So Julia herself, she was only loosely linked with the notorious female poisoners who today are known as the Five Widows of Rome. And her name came up during the interrogation of Geronima Spanner, who was her stepdaughter. Now, Julia herself, she was actually never prosecuted. And I think that only adds to her allure in modern retellings. And from this, lots of fantastical stories have emerged about her. One example is the slide I've got here. I mean, this image is often used to depict Julia, but it's actually called the love potion. And this is a totally different woman, and she's mixing love potion, not poison. But again, the narrative and the invention has just been created around the events of the 1600s. But that's not to say that there wasn't a loose network of women operating in Rome. But probably in many cases, this was more out of necessity and survival rather than some kind of fundamental greater good. And from January to May 1659, there are a series of arrests made, starting with Giovanna de Grandes, who was the witch the Ferry sisters were seen talking to. And there's official records from this time. And the investigation that was made hints not at a close group of women, but more a loose acquaintance of women and mistrust between them. And it wasn't like it was a group of women who were scheming and plotting together in candlelit rooms. When the women were arrested, they would spend a few months in Tordinona prison. Now, this was built on the banks of the Tiber, and it was infamous for its dank, windowless cells with names such as Purgatory, the Pit, and Hell. And when the river flooded, so did the cells. Now, the prison itself is actually situated just across the road from where the Ferry sisters, Elena and Angela Armelina, lived. So when they were arrested on the 10th of February, after being named by Giovanna, they didn't actually have far to go. And they would be joining the women who had sold them the poison to kill their husbands 4 years earlier. Now, the investigation into the poisonings was led by a man called Stefano Bracchi. And I was actually quite surprised by the detail that went into the case, because in my head, when I think about police work from the 1600s, I think it's just going to be based on kind of torture and hearsay. But it seems that there's actually a genuine attempt was made to get to the truth. And there were many months of questioning suspects and witnesses. And in total, the actual official report that was created ran to 1,480 pages. So it's a good in-depth investigation for the time. But that doesn't mean it wasn't unpleasant. And the women did spend months and months in these cold, dark cells. Giovanna herself, she was actually arrested in an elaborate police sting. So there was a wife of one of the police officers, if that's the right terminology to use for this era, and she was called Vittoria. And she actually posed as a lady who wanted to be rid of her husband. And she arranged for Giovanna to visit her. And as part of the operation, Bracchi told two people to hide under a bed so they could listen in, and he himself hid behind a curtain. So maybe not the most sophisticated, but still effective in the day. And Viatora, she began to recount how her husband mistreated her, and she was really leading the conversation here. And she said that she had heard that Giovanna brewed a mixture that would put such people away. And Giovanna admitted that, yes, I have this poison, and it's been used many times to kill people in such a way that they don't swell up or show any sign of poisoning. So Vittoria, she asked if Giovanna had brought any, and she had. So a price was agreed, and then the poison was handed over. And at that moment, Vittoria, she shouted out, "Bracchi!" And the kind of revealed himself from behind the curtain, and the people under the bed dashed out, and the arrest was made. So Giovanna, she immediately denied any knowledge of the contents of the bottle, and she said that some woman had asked her to deliver it. However, later on to interrogation by Bracchi and Tordinona, she would continue to kind of embellish the story. And she said that, "I know that the liquid is meant to remove blemishes from the complexion. That's what the woman who gave it to me said." So she's trying to hide her understanding that this is poison. But her deception didn't last long. And just the next day, she actually confessed. So over the following days, she revealed the names of those for whom she had procured poison, including the Ferry sisters, and also other women who were involved in the brewing and distribution of it in Rome. And why she broke so quickly isn't known, but Giovanna herself, she wasn't a wealthy woman, and she survived day to day as best she could. And she said that she cared less about dying, but she did not want to be tortured. And she's actually been married 3 times, but every time she'd dropped down the social ladder and dropped down the social status and into near poverty. There's no evidence she actually poisoned any of her husbands, but she had watched as they had died and her children, family, and everybody around her had died. So perhaps she'd just given up on life because it no longer offered anything for her, and her spirit was broken. So her confessions would be key to unraveling the poisonings. And this side of the story is very different to what you often hear in retellings of it today on many blogs or podcasts, where they're always presented as these very, very brave heroines who are fighting against the system and the men who abuse them, and of a very sophisticated network of women kind of working underground to distribute this poison everywhere. But that isn't to say that these women were weak either, because they weren't. And they all had their own reasons and backgrounds and determination to do what they did. So Giarima Spanner, she's the most notorious of the 5 widows and is often seen as the ringleader. And she actually never confessed to it. She remained strong and always denied any knowledge or involvement with the poison. However, the evidence of the other witnesses that were being questioned over these months, it was stacked up against her. So she was also arrested and brought into custody. And as part of the process, torture was used, but not in the way that I expected. So instead of the person being questioned, being tortured, the other suspects were actually tortured in front of them. If I was being questioned, another suspect would be tortured in front of me, and hopefully seeing their suffering would mean that I would confess and spare the pain that they were suffering. Now, the preferred method was stappiado, where the wrists are bound together behind the back, and then the person would be hoisted up and suspended from their wrists, and this would mean that the full weight of the body was hanging on the shoulders, and it often caused dislocation and excruciating pain, often permanent damage. But interestingly, before torture was given, a doctor would have to make an examination to ensure that it's actually safe to do. So I'm not exactly sure this is a nice thing, but as it's torture is involved, but there was some thought there. And luckily for Giovanna, she actually failed her medical exam. So they used an alternative torture called Sibylla, and this involves wrapping cords around your fingers and then tightening them. So again, very, very painful, but less damaging to the body. And it also wasn't the first thing they reached for. It wasn't like the first day they were arrested, they started being tortured. It's only after 4 months of questioning and frustration and not getting confessions that Stefano Bracchi decided to resort to torture. And it also seems he tried to moderate his use of it, because at the time it was also starting to be understood that torture isn't necessarily an effective method of getting confessions out of people. So as the investigation continued, more names were given and more women were arrested. And Bracchi also felt that he needed to test the poison, which was handed over during the police sting. So they did this by collecting some dogs from the city and putting them in a cell and feeding them some meat dosed with the poison, and they found it worked. So they clearly knew they were working with poison, and they had caught Giovanna handing it over. Now, the poison itself often goes by the name of aqua tofana, and it was said to be concealed in a really beautiful looking bottle. It looked like a cosmetics, but this is the story you'll usually hear because it's more exciting and it's more romantic this way. The poison sitting in plain sight, known only to the women who could openly buy it. And whilst there is some evidence that maybe the poison was sometimes disguised this way, the truth is it's more likely that it was in a very small, simple bottle, because many of the women who were buying this, they were poor, they were terrified, and they needed something that was going to be really easy to hide. They didn't want to be caught. So the idea of women secretly flaunting the poison right beneath their husband's nose, daring them to discover it, is a modern invention. I think this does a real disservice to the suffering and fear that the women faced. It's not telling their story of what was happening to them. So finally, after months of denials and contradicting, the five widows would be sentenced to death by hanging on 5th of July, 1659. All Jeronima had confessed, and she had remained steadfast in her denial, according to the official record that was written at the time. Oh, sorry, I've just lost my place. But so the official record says that she never ever confessed. Sorry, 1 second. But you will report today that she did confess under torture, or just even the prospect of being tortured, but there is no evidence at all. And the evidence actually suggests otherwise, because as she had never confessed, by law she could not be executed. But Pope Alexander VII, he signed a papal decree condemning her to the gallows. Such was the danger that she was seen to pose. And another story you often hear is that the five women were all murderers and that they had killed their own husbands. But as you'll soon see, this was another mistruth, and it started before or on the day of their execution. Oh, sorry, I've lost my place again. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so there's no evidence that any of these women themselves were actually murderers or had ever poisoned anyone. What they were guilty of was brewing and trafficking the poison, and according to some written reports, of having given women the means to commit the most atrocious crimes. And it seems that maybe the women they sold it to didn't always need the poison, because they didn't always need were in a desperate situation and needing a way out. Witnesses were in, suggested that the poison had always been pushed upon them and they were encouraged to use it. And they may not have actually all been in marriages which were so bad that the only way out was murder or warranted murder. For instance, after the poisoning, their husbands, the Ferry sisters, saw this as a really good business opportunity, and there was money to be made, and they wanted in on the act. So if we remember back to the beginning of the story, they were seen arguing with a old woman in the streets. And at this time, they had actually been trying to get hold of some poison themselves that they could sell on. And this kind of open scene out on the street, this kind of shouting and this disturbance is probably one of the primary causes of why there was the eventual discovery of this kind of network of women and these poisonings, and led to their eventual arrest and execution. So 5th of July, 1659, the day started with confessions taken, and the women's final wishes were put in order. All but Jeromia Spanner were consigned to their fate, but she too would soon reluctantly accept it. As one commentator rather, later claimed, no pen can describe what shrieks, what a row, what outcries these wretches made. It suffices for readers to know that they could be heard all the way to Piazza San Salvatore in Laurel. So it seems this wasn't true either, because the official records say that the women were quiet on the day or the morning of their execution. They weren't shouting, they weren't hysterical. So again, there's more stories and narratives and layers and mistruths being layered on all the time. But on the fateful day, crowds lined the streets and they followed the slave procession from Tordonora prison to Campo de Fiori, where the executions would take place. Now, rather than the usual direct route that would be taken from the prison to the square, the Pope ordered that they be paraded for 2 hours through the city's major streets, because he wanted to make a real example of them. And during this procession, the hangman's assistants, he would regularly shout out to the crowds things like, "These widows are being put to death for brewing poison to kill not only their husbands, but other persons as well." As we know, they did not kill their husbands. There's no evidence of that. Yes, some of their husbands had died, but others of the women, they were happily married. So from the very first moments, the story of the five widows was beginning to take on a life of its own. Now, the rooms surrounding the Campo de Foro Square, they've been rented out to the highest bidder because everybody wanted to have the best view of this spectacle of these five women. And a chandler's shop near the gallows, it would serve to keep the women housed until it was their time to be executed. Now, each of them had been accompanied by a comforter. Now, this is a shrouded figure whose face would remain unseen by the crowd, but they would help comfort them in their final moments and help their souls to heaven and just look after them. So even despite what they've done, there's still a respect there. Now, finally, after hours of waiting, the crowd got what it wanted. The first woman was led out, and her eyes were blindfolded, and the rope was already like weighing down her neck. And she'd be guided up the steps to the stage for what would be her final performance. And the crowds must have jeered and shouted in the sweltering summer sun. Now, eyes covered, the sound must have been terrifying for her as she inched her way tentatively forwards, guided only by the hangman and the comforter. And finally, she'd take one more step, one last step, out under air, with nothing to catch her but a rope around her neck. And there she would hang until dead as the crowd celebrated her fate. She'd be followed by the next of the five, each woman being hung in turn. And during the afternoon, though, the hangman, he seemed to enjoy his moment of fame too much, and he took too long over proceedings, and he took too much pleasure in the spectacle. And he was actually replaced by his assistant, and he was arrested. Even during these tumultuous events, there's this strange kind of respect there continued, and I find it quite an unusual juxtaposition of what's going on. But as the bodies of these women swung in the breeze and the spectators started to dissipate and leave the square, as the vast crowd melted into the streets, they took with them as many retellings of the five widows as there were onlookers that fateful day. That's the end. Thank you.
All right. Rick, thank you very much. Uh, we have no questions that I can see. So, people in the audience, if you want to put some questions in, we've got about 10 minutes left. But in the meantime, we can just have a little discussion. Uh,
Okay, sure.
so, I mean, this is a multi-layered level of deception here. And the one hand, you have the underhanded
Yeah.
uh, secret murders of these women, but then also there's lots of accumulated lies and misinformation about these events that have come up over time. You have the deception in the history and the deception in the historiography, to put it another way. Uh,
Mhm.
do you think that those are related at all? Does a story that's about something underhanded like this naturally lend itself to people twisting the truth?
I think it makes it easier to do that because if you've got that layer of deception there in the events that happened, then it can be easier to tell the narrative that you want on top of that story, particularly as historically women haven't always been seen in the best lights. There's often been a lot of negative views towards them because so I think with each retelling, it would have the layers that people wanted to tell. So I think traditionally you'd see women as they were evil, they were poisoners, and then you get the more modern retellings where now they're heroes and they're heroines and they're amazing and they're beautiful and they're amazing, they're defeating the system, and the truth is going to be somewhere there in the middle. It's with each kind of generation that tells this story, they bring their own retelling and their own narrative to it.
So we got a couple of questions coming in. Steve asks, "Do we know when the first literary representation of these women started?
Um,
Or what was the earliest
there
you
were
found?"
there were immediately some stories about them in like the local pamphlets or papers or publications at the time. So I think one of the quotes there said how they were shrieking and crying and on the day of the execution. So that it started immediately when we had these retellings, because the actual official transcript that was written down, that was kept in the Vatican archives, and then I think it went into another archive in Rome, and that wasn't discovered until the 1880s. So that true kind of, well, as true as we think it must be. So I presume they try to keep the narrative accurate in the official transcripts. That was lost for a couple of 100 years. So during all of that time, we did have different stories and retellings written down. I don't know the exact date of the first ones though, but I did come across evidence that had been covered many times by different people.
That's relevant to the other question that's here from Arena. I'm not sure how I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Who asked, in their own era, was there a suggestion that the stories might have been exaggerated or false, or is that only a sort of a modern revision thing as this new evidence has come to light?
I'm not sure actually. Yeah, I don't know if there was any suggestion at the time. Because one interesting, I think it's after they were executed, two women were overheard on the street talking about that they had been offered this poison when and that they were then taken in for questioning as well. And they said they didn't want it. They didn't actually want to kill their husbands. So not exactly answering the question, but it was there were people in the city in Rome who were connected to these women or had contact with them who probably would have had certain views on it. So they might have said, yeah, these women were really pushing this on me. But then other women who are in very, very desperate situations, they were probably incredibly grateful. So I think there would have been different interpretations and retellings of contact, for sure.
You explained how this started with one woman and expanded to encompass several more. Would you say that this sparked, as these things often do, a sort of broader panic, sort of capital P panic about husband poisoning, wives poisoning their husbands, etc., or was the seen as more of a particular curiosity about the small number of women doing it? Did it become a social fear?
I think there would have been, but it was just, well, it's during the period of the plague. So that covered up a lot of the deaths. So it was like, okay, what are they dying from? Is it from poison? Is it from plague? Because you read in some places that maybe up to 500 men were murdered. So, and the fact that there was the papal decree to ensure that all the women could be executed, even if they hadn't confessed, hints that there must have been some higher level of panic there. And then during their executions, they apparently if you had like lemon and water or something, that would be the cure for the poison. So they made sure that everybody was aware of that in the city. Like the crowds, they told the crowds how to cure it. And yeah, I think there was an element of panic, definitely. Yeah.
Do you see this story as, or where do you see the story on a scale from typical to exceptional? Like on the one hand, you can imagine this is a purely exceptional story of like unusual people doing an unusual thing, and it's a one-off deal. Then you could see it as entirely representative of broader, and maybe just a slightly more sensationalized version of broader trends relating to these social issues. Where do you see it in that
Mm,
spectrum?
it's a difficult one because I think it certainly would have happened at other times, and there had been other women or other groups of people who were looking at poisoning. I don't know if it's particularly typical to Rome or to Italy, or if in other countries you'd have similar things happening. Because you would have, say, later on, when arsenic started to be put into rat poisons, then there was a real fear and a concern that there was going to be mass poisonings because suddenly all these poisons were available to the general public and they could just go and buy them from the shop. So there's always been periods in history where you could where these panics happened. So I wouldn't say it's particularly exceptional, but then I also don't think this is a one-off event at all. I think there would have been other times where desperate people in desperate times they reach for what they can do.
Favorite's maybe not the right word, but was there a particular element of the story that you particularly appreciated or found interesting, more so than the rest?
Um, I think for me, when I started reading about it more, and I started just looking online at different blogs and articles and things, and then when I found one of the books, the main one I used for my research, and it actually referenced back to the original documents that was used in the original transcripts from the trial. I think what really caught my interest was that first of all, it's an interesting story, was but how it's been changed by people over time. So that's
Yeah.
kind of what I wanted to hopefully bring across here, how the story has been changed. Yes, I think that.
Sure. Steve asks if the number of victims has risen over the years through the retellings.
um, I don't know. I don't have evidence, but I'd say probably yes, because when you hear some people talking about it now, they get so excited by it. So I think the number probably goes up every year.
Uh, yeah, maybe one day we'll talk about how the so-called Black Death was actually mostly wives killing their husbands and being executed for
Yeah.
it. But uh, all right. Well, I don't see any more questions, so I will. I think we'll wrap this up now. Give everyone an extra 5 minutes of time, and hope to see everyone at the next sessions. Uh, we have presentations from pen names, from popular history, the ancient and esoteric order of the jackalope, and prime time. So see everyone at the next session. Thank you, Rick.
Okay, thanks very much. Take care, everyone.